In ancient times, in the midst of the blood war, the forces of law and good that dwell on Mount Celestia issued a decree. This decree was a massive indictment, a list of accusations levied against Asmodeus for his cosmic crimes. The Lord of the Nine Hells, apparently appalled by the charges, did not retreat. Instead, he rebuked them and petitioned the Celestials for a trial. To ensure the utmost fairness, Asmodeus suggested the proceedings take place in front of Primus, the ultimate pillar of law and leader of the Modrons. Surely, Primus would issue a fair verdict. The angels agreed, and Asmodeus drafted a contract post-haste, which the angels, trusting in the process of law and their own scrutables, signed. At the trial, Asmodeus testified that his actions were dictated by two things: law and the survival of the cosmos. He admitted that his actions sway mortals to evil, but he argued a crucial point. He and his minions never break a contract, even when the terms turn against the devil. More importantly, he pointed out that the souls he harvests are the fuel used to hold back the infinite legions of the abyss. Without the Nine Hells, chaos would reign victorious. The angels, the heavens, even Primus himself would be destroyed. Their very existence relied on the noble pursuit of Asmodeus' law. Then it was the angels' turn. One after another, they came before Primus to testify to Asmodeus' many crimes. The line of witnesses seemed indeterminable. The testimony stretched into weeks. While the realm of Mechanus is a place of clockwork precision, it is not a realm of infinite time. Primus eventually informed the angels that only a few more would be allowed to speak. As the angels argued amongst themselves over who should have the final word, a fight broke out. One angel, a Solar, pushed her way to the front and demanded to be heard, causing a brawl. Asmodeus looked upon this chaos, looked upon this Solar with a smirk. That angel was Zariel in her former life before she became the Archduke of Avernus. And there's a prevailing theory online that Zariel is a tragic hero. Rootsmith, in the video Zariel is a Hero, argues that her defining trait is a hatred for stagnancy. He suggests that while the other angels are passive little butlers who simply take orders, Zariel's first truly heroic act was one of defiance. In this view, she isn't a villain who fell, she's a warrior who realized that beautiful home of the gods was actually a stagnant brick wall. In Runesmith's view, Zariel is a hero because she was the only one willing to dive headfirst into the Nine Hells and end a war that heaven was too lazy to fight.
This action was driven by her best and most heroic trait, hatred for stagnance. Even in the face of opposition, she refused to turn a blind eye to unjust suffering. If something that you watch over sucks, and you know it sucks, it's no one's job but yours to fix it. And that's the defining trait of a hero.
This sentiment is echoed by William Stark of D&D Legends and Lore, who frames Zariel's choice through a cosmic paradox. Stark points out that evil prevails when those who are good do nothing. If Zariel had stayed on her perch in Celestia, she would be conceding the souls of the multiverse to the infinite hunger of the abyss. From this perspective, Zariel's decision to memorize the faces of the dead and take up the sword was the only moral response to an indifferent universe.
A cosmic paradox. Evil prevails when those who are good do nothing to stop it. Allowing the blood war to continue unimpeded means to concede the loss of countless lives and souls across the multiverse. Countless to be brutalized, twisted and perverted by demons. Countless to be subjugated and tortured by the devils. And yet, interfering in the delicate balance of the blood war threatens to do much worse. On one hand, reality itself would be undone. And on the other, somewhat more preferable hand, but not by much, an all-powerful archfiend ends up ruling the universe.
Stark presents this as a moral choice, framing this paradox as a catch-22 where good is essentially a synonym for inactive. If you accept this framing, Zariel isn't just a hero, she's the only hero. She's the only one willing to get her hands dirty. But is that true? Is Zariel a hero? Let's take a look at another character who shares some striking parallels with Zariel. Instigating that brawl in the very halls of absolute law was the first sign. It was the crack in the porcelain. Here was an angel who was tired of the bureaucracy, the petitions, and the polite inaction of Celestia. She was an angel ready to take action, and in that moment she shares a soul with the devil of Hell's Kitchen. In the quiet of a late-night office in Hell's Kitchen, Matt Murdock isn't a hero, he's a failure. He's a lawyer, a man who spent his life learning the process. He believed that the law was a living thing, a shield forged from centuries of human wisdom and divine intent. But as he sits there, his hypersenses tuned to the heartbeat of his city being systematically bled dry, he realizes that the shield is made of paper. He can hear the Wilson Fisks of the world in their ivory towers, laughing as they use the very laws Matt swore to uphold to bury their victims. Matt observes the mechanical failures of justice. He sits in the back of a courtroom and hears the spike in a witness's heart rate when they are stared down by a mob enforcer. He hears the rhythmic, cold scratching of a judge's pen, signing a release form for a known killer because a piece of evidence was filed 10 minutes late. To the court, that's due process. To the law, that is a successful adherence to the rules. But to Matt Murdock, listening to that killer's steady, arrogant pulse as he walks out the front door, the law is no longer sufficient. It's a failure that costs lives. This is the limit of lawful good. It is the point where a good person realizes that his own morality is being used as a weapon against him. The Wilson Fisks of the world don't hate the law. They love it. They hide behind its protections, exploit its slow pace, and use its requirements for fairness to ensure they are never touched. The change for Murdock happens when he accepts that the process is working exactly as intended for those who own it. He feels the impotence like a physical weight in his chest. So, after hours, Murdock puts on a mask. He wraps his knuckles in rags and steps into the rain. He will do what must be done. He decides that if the system is designed to let the guilty walk, then he must design a new system, one built on broken ribs and whispered threats in dark alleys. He stops caring about whether his actions are legal and starts caring only about whether they are effective. He abandons the rules because he can no longer afford the luxury of following them. Now imagine that frustration multiplied by an eternity. Zariel was not born of perdition. She was a Solar of Lathander, the Morning Lord. She was the embodiment of the dawn, representing renewal, birth, and the relentless hope of a new dawn. But for Zariel, every dawn brought only the same stagnant carnage. Her divine mandate was to observe the blood war, to stand on the edge of the pit, keep tabs on the unending conflict, and report back to Celestia on whether the forces of chaos were sufficiently contained by the devils. So, day after day, Zariel watched an infinite tide of demons crashing against the legions of the 9 hells. Mortals twisted into soldiers, ground into dust in the red mud. Victories that meant nothing, losses that changed nothing. A war that did not progress, did not resolve, did not end. And over time, something began to break. When you are the embodiment of a new dawn, what does it mean when nothing ever changes? Zariel began to see the war differently. She began to suspect that Asmodeus was intentionally prolonging the war. Through her long watch, Zariel reached a conclusion that tasted like cosmic sedition. Asmodeus was a parasite feeding on the stalemate. The bulwark he claimed to be was a lie. He wasn't the watcher on the wall, he was a jailer, keeping the multiverse in a state of permanent fear to justify his own existence. Zariel believed in a more simple truth, that evil could be ended. If the golden hosts of Celestia combined their might, they could wipe the board clean of both demon and devil in one final, righteous stroke. It was, after all, their cosmic duty to destroy evil, not to monitor it. But Celestia was silent. Zariel was repeatedly rebuked by her peers, told to stay in her lane and maintain the balance. She didn't stop, though. She was so consumed by her theory that she began training mortals, the Hell Riders, preparing for the day her peers would finally see reason. That day never came. Instead, in 1354 DR, the war would find her. A cadre of demons led by the beast of butchery, Yinogu, tore open a rift and spilled into a village that Zariel had been charged with protecting. These were people who lived by the Morning Lord's promise, who expected the dawn to bring safety and renewal. Instead, on this day, the sun rose on a landscape of butchery. Infinite, senseless chaos began scouring the life out of a place Zariel was sworn to preserve. For a Solar of Lathander, every scream from the village must have felt like a physical blow to her mandate. The higher powers in Celestia remained detached, tethered to a neutrality that, in this moment, must have felt like an execution. To Zariel, this is where observing was no longer possible, and she made a choice. Zariel and her Hell Riders descended, purging the village before charging headlong into the portal the demons swarmed out of, a portal that led to Avernus. This was the Ride, a seemingly suicidal mission born of pure, desperate heroism? Spite? No, action. The combat was a nightmare of iron and fire, but as the Hell Riders were overwhelmed by the legions of hell, the betrayal set in. Some of the mortals she had trained, headed by Jander Sunstar, fled back through the portal, sealing it behind them in shame. As her loyal riders beside her fell, Zariel was eventually left alone. She did not retreat. She could not retreat. Even if the betrayal of Sunstar and the sealing of the portal did not occur, would Zariel have retreated anyhow? In her mind, she was still an angel, and an angel's duty is to destroy evil until their last cosmic breath. Imagine the emotional agony of that moment, standing atop a mountain of the dead, looking up at a sky that offered no help, realizing that the hope she represented had been a lie. When Zariel finally collapsed into the red dust, the gnashing hunger of the abyss didn't claim her. Asmodeus watched a Solar of the Morning Lord, broken, bleeding, and abandoned by the light, and saw a revelation. He had her dragged from the meat grinder and brought before his throne. There, Asmodeus did what the heavens refused. He listened. He didn't need to break her spirit. The silence of Celestia had already done that. Instead, he pointed back at the horizon she had just retreated from, at the golden hosts who watched her fall and offered nothing but a report. He titled her his champion. He crowned her the Archduke of Avernus. With a single legalistic stroke, he granted her the absolute authority she had begged for in the halls of Mount Celestia. He unleashed her, at last, upon the infinities of the abyss, to act as the guardian of the multiverse. To Celestia, this was a fall from grace, but to Zariel, it was ascension to stay in the fight. She became a specter, a warning of what happens when the right way to win stops being an option. And this is where another character comparison comes in. Another ghost who forgoes the right way to win to defend his home. In the story Ghost of Tsushima, Jin Sakai faces this exact contradiction. He is a samurai sworn to a rigid code of honor that values the manner of the fight over the outcome. When an unstoppable Mongol invasion threatens to erase his home, Jin realizes that his honor is a luxury that the dying cannot afford. The samurai code, the law of his world, demanded he fight head-on, in the open, even if it meant certain death for every innocent person on the island. So, Jin broke the code. He became the ghost, He used poison he struck from the shadows, and he turned the enemy's own terror against them. By the end of his journey, Jin defeats the Mongols, but he was also branded a criminal by his own family. The shogun, the government, didn't care that Jin saved Tsushima. They cared that his method of winning proved their honor, their law, was a paper shield, and they exiled him. Jin fell from a place of nobility to a lowly wanted criminal. This is the exact frequency Zariel is operating on in Avernus. She broke her code and became the ghost of the multiverse. She looked at the polite inaction of Celestia, the honorable angels who watched villages burn while filing reports, and she decided that their purity was a form of cowardice. She shed her solar wings and abandoned the light. Because the light wasn't winning the war, she accepted the crown of Avernus to do the dirty work that the heavens were too holy to touch. She has optimized hell into a high-efficiency soul-processing engine because she, like Jin, believes that a dishonorable victory is better than an honorable extinction. Thus far, the argument for Zariel's heroism has been an exercise in consequentialism. The idea that the morality of an action is determined solely by the outcome. If the blood war prevents the abyss from consuming the multiverse, then whatever sustains that war can be justified. But the means are what separate a hero from a villain. Matt Murdock abandons the legal system because he recognizes its failures, but he imposes a limit on himself. He refuses to kill. He refuses to treat human life as expendable, even when doing so would be more expedient. His entire identity as Daredevil depends on that constraint. Without it, he becomes indistinguishable from the people he fights. Shin Sakai breaks his code as a samurai, but the cost of that decision is primarily borne by himself. He sacrifices his honor, his status, and his place in society to protect the people of Tsushima. The consequences of his actions are internalized. He pays for them. Zariel does something fundamentally different. She does not absorb the cost of her decision, she distributes it. When she abandons the inefficient good of Celestia, she restructures the system so that others bear the burden of the blood war. Mortals become soldiers, then currency, then fuel. The suffering required to sustain her war effort is something she administers, not personally endures. This is the point where the argument for her heroism collapses. It is not only that Zariel uses violence and extreme methods, it is that her methods require the systematic conversion of her people into means. The multiverse may survive, but it survives through a process that treats individual lives as disposable inputs. And that distinction matters because it is the difference between a character who sacrifices themselves for others and a character who sacrifices others for a goal. This is where the debate usually operates on three levels. The first is definitional. Zariel is lawful evil, therefore she cannot be a hero. But we know alignment is descriptive, not prescriptive. The second is utilitarian. If the blood war is the only thing holding back the abyss, then Zariel becomes a functional necessity. A monster, perhaps, but a necessary one. At this level, the only metric that matters is whether the system works. But this logic stops one step too soon. It accounts for the outcome, but ignores the cost. Zariel's soul-crushing war machine may hold back the abyss, but who is being fed into the furnace?
You haven't seen the last of old Karlach yet, soldier.
Karlach Cliffgate wasn't a cosmic player or an angel debating the law. She was a kid from the outer city who took a job as a bodyguard because she had plenty of pluck and a family to support. She wasn't looking to be a hero, she was looking for a paycheck to survive. That was enough to get her noticed, and eventually she became the personal bodyguard to Enver Gortash. Their relationship was fortuitous but ended the way these stories often do when power enters the equation. Gortash needed capital to fund his ambitions, so he sold Karlach into Zariel's army, along with the promise that she would be useful.
I looked after that fucker with my life. I trusted him. He gave me away to Zariel without a second thought.
Zariel didn't see a hero in Karlach. She didn't see a comrade in arms. She didn't even see a person. She saw a prototype, a specimen, a lab rat. She tore out Karlach's heart, the metaphorical seat of her joy, and replaced it with an infernal engine. An engine that runs on the misery of crushed souls. An engine that burns so hot it makes it impossible for Karlach to even touch another person without killing them. This is what Zariel's heroism looks like in practice. Karlach becomes a prized fighter, a title that sounds honorable until it is understood as maintenance language, like a reliable wrench, like equipment that performs as expected. The point here isn't that Zariel is willing to use violence. Every character we've discussed is willing to use violence. The distinction is that Zariel reorganizes the structure around her so that other people absorb the cost of that violence. Karlach is not protected from the horrors of the Blood War, she is integrated into them. Her body becomes infrastructure, and her spirit becomes the cost. Karlach is not an exception. She is a small-scale example of a much larger system, and that system is made explicit in Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus. 50 years before the events of BG3, the city of Elturel faces annihilation at the hands of an undead force. When the High Overseer, Thavius Krieg, begs the cosmos for salvation, Zariel offers it in the form of the Companion, a second sun that burns away the undead and restores order to the city. The price is the Creed Resolute, a contract that binds the entire city's souls to her authority. When the contract matures, the Companion goes dark, and Elturel is dragged into Avernus, chained above the river Styx. What was presented as protection is revealed to be acquisition. Soul coins are the clearest expression of this system. Cold iron discs containing bound mortal souls. If you hold one to your ear, you can hear the muffled rhythmic screaming of the person trapped inside. Souls are processed, traded, stored, and consumed. These coins function as currency, but more importantly, they function as fuel. They are fed into infernal war machines and burned to power movement across the wasteland, forcing the players to participate in an economy of agony. You see this dehumanization mirrored in Zariel's lieutenants, Haruman and Elanthius. They represent the only two outcomes of her leadership. Haruman is the true believer, a general who accepts the war as absolute necessity and continues it without question. Elanthius is the hollow shell, aware of the horror but convinced the system requires him anyway. In Zariel's world, you either become a fanatic or a corpse that hasn't realized it's dead yet. Descent into Avernus offers a resolution to all of this. The Sword of Zariel contains the last remnant of her former self, the piece of her that still aligns with the values she once represented. If the player characters recover it and return it to her, she changes. Her form shifts back to an angel, her allegiance returns to Celestia, and she severs the chains binding Elturel, returning the city to the material plane. This is framed as the best possible outcome. It resolves the immediate crisis, avoids the complications of killing an archdevil, and restores a fallen figure to her original state. Structurally, it is clean and efficient. Within the logic of the game, it delivers closure that feels both decisive and earned by the players. There are good reasons the story is built this way. The most obvious is that it is a D&D adventure, but framing Zariel as a tragic figure places her within a familiar narrative structure. She becomes a fallen hero who made the wrong choice under pressure, someone whose story can be resolved through recognition and reversal. It also serves a practical function. Redeeming her is the most stable solution available. Killing her creates a power vacuum and leaves the problem of Elturel unresolved. Redeeming her produces an immediate and controlled outcome. The city is saved, the crisis ends, and the players are given a clear sense of completion. but that framing depends on a very specific definition of the problem. It treats Zariel as an individual who lost her way, rather than as the architect of a system and an individual who subscribes to a very specific framework. Once she is restored, the narrative is free to move on, because the central conflict has been reduced to her internal state. The resolution operates almost entirely at the level of Zariel herself. It answers the question of whether she can become good again. It does not address the structure she built while she was not. Karlach's condition does not change because Zariel remembers who she used to be. The soul coins already spent do not return as the people they were made from. The countless individuals processed through her system remain where they are. The logic that justified their use is not dismantled. It is simply no longer being actively administered by her. This is why the resolution is incomplete. It treats Zariel's time as Archduke as a deviation, rather than as the deliberate construction of a system that continues to exist beyond her. It restores the person without accounting for the consequences of what that person built, because Karlach is still burning. Up to this point, the argument against Zariel's heroism has been grounded in consequences. She distributes the cost of war to others as opposed to internalizing it. That alone is enough to separate her from figures like Matt Murdock or Jin Sakai. But if we want to evaluate whether she is redeemable, we need a more precise framework than intuition or tone. And for that, I want to bring in a structure proposed by Anthony Gramuglia, of the channel Anthony Gramuglia, in his discussion of how fiction attempts to redeem fascists. His argument lays out 3 conditions that must be met for a redemption to feel earned. First, the ideology must be deconstructed. Second, the character must actively atone. And third, the victims must be allowed the choice of forgiveness. If any one of these is missing, the redemption fails. Not necessarily morally, but narratively. Before applying that framework, though, there is an obvious objection. It only works if Zariel is actually operating within a fascist logic. If she is simply a tragic general making hard choices in a cosmic war, then the framework does not apply. So now, the question becomes, is Zariel a brutal utilitarian, or is she committed to a specific ideological structure, fascism? There's a strong case that it is the latter, and it isn't a claim we have to invent from scratch. The framework Gramuglia is drawing from traces back to Umberto Eco's essay on what he calls fascism, a set of recurring traits that define fascist ideology across different contexts. Eco's point is that fascism is more than a single historical regime. It is a pattern of thinking, a way of organizing the world around action, hierarchy, and permanent conflict. Gramuglia's 3 pillars are built on that foundation. They are responses to a specific kind of ideology, one that justifies harm through structure rather than impulse. If Zariel fits that pattern, then the framework applies cleanly. And she does. One of Eco's core traits is the cult of action for action's sake. The idea that action is inherently virtuous, independent of reflection or outcome. This is the axis around which Zariel's entire fall turns. The hosts of Celestia observe, deliberate, and restrain themselves. Zariel interprets that restraint as failure. She does not arrive at that conclusion through careful disagreement. She rejects the process. Action becomes proof of moral seriousness. But action detached from outcome, insulated from evidence, and treated as a moral good in itself. What makes this more than impatience is that her alternative has historical precedence. The Celestials had already attempted direct intervention in the Blood War in ages past. They descended in force, fought both sides, and failed. In fact, their presence only escalated the slaughter, forcing a temporary alliance between the devils and demons that drove the heavens back. Zariel, whose role was to observe the war, would be intimately aware of this. That context does matter, because Zariel acts in total defiance of the history she was tasked to observe. Rather than tempering her belief, the failure of previous interventions only reinforces it. To Zariel, a persisting war proves only that past efforts lacked sufficient decisiveness. At that point, action becomes a self-sustaining principle, divorced from feasibility and persisting even in the face of impossibility. The Abyss is an infinite, bottomless structure. Winning the Blood War would necessitate dismantling a fundamental layer of the multiverse, making escalation an exercise in futility. It is a reality to be managed rather than a war to be won. Zariel meets this reality by intensifying her commitment instead of revising her goal. The very impossibility of victory justifies her eternal violence. In this framework, motion is the only requirement. Success is secondary. Because her actions are detached from outcomes, they are insulated from falsification. Failure cannot invalidate her crusade. It simply fuels the demand for more action. That belief intensifies once she enters Avernus. The Blood War becomes the only meaningful context for decision-making. Participation in that war defines moral worth. Anyone who is not actively fighting is treated as complicit in the Abyss. Peace is recast as surrender. Neutrality becomes betrayal. The world narrows until everything is measured against a single question. Are you contributing to the war effort? Echo also describes fascism as a system of rigid hierarchy, where value flows downward and contempt follows it. Zariel's Avernus operates on exactly that structure. Authority is absolute, worth is determined by utility. Her lieutenants are either fanatics who embrace her logic, or hollow figures who endure it because they believe there is no alternative. Mortals enter the system as recruits, are refined into soldiers, and eventually reduced further into fuel. Each stage strips away autonomy and personhood, and replaces it with function. Even more telling is how this logic behaves when confronted with corruption inside the system itself. Remember, Zariel believes Asmodeus is an actor who is deliberately prolonging the Blood War for his personal gain. While a conventional moral framework would view this as a reason to undermine cooperation, suggesting the entire structure is compromised. Zariel's response is the opposite. She joins him regardless. Her reasoning aligns with her earlier commitments. If the supreme moral category is participation in the war, then even a manipulator who acts is preferable to those who hesitate. Because Asmodeus sustains the system's motion, he is superior to the Celestials, whose position she treats as a mere refusal to engage. This is a consistent hierarchy built upon an irrational foundation, rather than a contradiction. With action elevated to the highest good, coherence is measured by participation in the system's momentum instead of outcomes or truth. Zariel adopts the normalization of permanent war, one of Echo's recurring traits, as the default condition that legitimizes all moral action. To her, she may tacitly be trying to end the Blood War, but the Blood War is a system to be optimized, not ended. Even the suspicion that Asmodeus exploits the conflict fails to trigger a rejection of the system. She joins it because it represents a structure of constant action. This establishes the structural condition that Gramulia's framework is designed to evaluate. Zariel's actions transcend simple high-pressure decision-making. She operates within an ideological structure that necessitates action, demands hierarchy, and treats endless conflict as the default. Within this domain, within her domain, violence is a produced and sustained requirement rather than an incidental byproduct. And consequently, the inquiry shifts from the descriptive to the reparative. The central question now is no longer establishing Zariel's fascism, but the possibility of meaningful redemption for a character so thoroughly embedded in a fascist system, and the specific narrative costs such a redemption would require. With that established, we can evaluate her redemption. The first requirement in Gramulia's 3 pillars is ideological deconstruction. The character must confront the logic that justified their actions and recognize it as false. Descent into Avernus partially achieves this. The Sword of Zariel functions as a catalyst for reflection. It reconnects her to the values she abandoned and forces a moment of recognition and real reflection. For the first time in centuries, she is pulled outside the closed system of her own reasoning and made to see it from the outside. But the deconstruction is compressed into a single moment. It does not meaningfully engage with the scale of her prior certainty. Zariel is not someone who drifted into evil through confusion. She is someone who spent centuries enforcing a certain worldview, refining it, acting on it, and then building systems around it. The narrative asks her to abandon that worldview almost instantly. The result feels less like a dismantling of ideology and more like a reversal of state. The second requirement is active atonement. It is not enough for the character to feel remorse, they must materially attempt to repair the harm they caused. Here the redemption is even thinner. Zariel frees El Terrell and relinquishes her position. While these are significant actions, they are also the minimum necessary to resolve the immediate crisis of the plot, rather than the victims of her reign. The broader system she built and helped maintain remains intact. The souls already processed into devils or coins are not restored, the infrastructure of Avernus does not meaningfully change, and the war continues. True atonement requires sustained, outward-facing effort. Time, sacrifice, and the dismantling of the very structures that produced the harm. Instead, Zariel's journey concludes precisely where that work should begin. The third requirement, the victim's choice, is the pillar the story ignores almost entirely. Redemption does not grant automatic forgiveness. The harmed must be allowed to accept or reject the perpetrator's transformation. Karlach does not get her heart back because Zariel has a moment of clarity. The souls burned in war machines are never consulted. The countless mortals bound into infernal contracts are not given a voice in the outcome. The story resolves the crisis and abruptly closes, leaving personal and systemic consequences in place. This is why the redemption strikes hollow. It treats Zariel's internal clarity as the conclusion of her responsibility rather than its starting point. Under Grimulia's framework, this is not a successful redemption. The ideology is only briefly interrupted, as opposed to dismantle. The atonement is limited to the plot's convenience, and the victims are excluded. What remains is an efficient, dramatic closure that sidesteps the central problem. Zariel set out to end the blood war through force and became part of the machinery that sustains it. As an angel, she changed nothing. As an archdevil, she changed nothing. Even in redemption, the structure of the conflict remains exactly as it was. Zariel hates the stagnation of an action, but all her actions did was cause more of it. Nothing changed. The war persists, the system persists, the costs persist. If that is the outcome, then redemption failed, and her story is not a tragedy of a hero who fell and was restored. Instead, it is a demonstration of a different kind of failure. Structural irrelevance. All that suffering, all that transformation, and the equation of the universe remains unchanged.